Hey everybody, Corey Wakefield here, and welcome to today's header and footer builder video. Today we are taking a deep dive into the proverbial pool of Flexbox. We knew when we were starting to put these builders together a little over a year ago that we wanted everything to be powered with Flexbox because we saw, the ability it contained. We also knew, pretty early on that there's a lot to take in with it. It's pretty funky if you guys haven't taken the time to read through anything about it. There's a lot going on with your main and cross axis, how the items behave inside there, orientation, all these new terms like flex growing and basis and shrink, and it can make your head swim a little bit. And it certainly took me a little bit of time to wrap my brain around, okay, like here's how these pieces of the puzzle all kind of fit together. So we knew we wanted to unlock this power for everyone to take part in, but we knew that we were really going to have to work on making it much more approachable because it's just kind of funky. So if you guys haven't, I do recommend taking some time to read through an online article or tutorial. There's a great write-up here on scotch.io about some basics, and it really goes into detail on different properties and how things function. There's a really great visual guide to Flexbox on CSS tricks that has some really cool images to explain things. I'm not going to walk through these today just because we could be here forever, and I'm sure you don't want to hear me just read things off. You want to see cool functional examples, which we're going to do. But the main thing to take away is how Flexbox works between a parent or a container and a child or its flex items. So we're going to walk through that in a second and show you the two controls that we have built that kind of handle all this stuff in one nice little neat tidy package. I will probably reference these a little bit as I go through some of these examples, so I'll leave them up. But we will just dive right on in here. So first thing I'm going to do is add a container and have it fill all that space. Let me add some buttons here so we can see some of this in action. And then I'll just change the colors here so that we can tell our buttons apart. Just a little bit of setup, no biggie. All right, there we go. So here are the two flex controls that you will want to familiarize yourself with in the tool that, like I said, really abstract away all the stuff from a flex container, which is this flex layout control, and a flex item, which sometimes you'll see labeled as like self flex. Sometimes it will say item flex. It just kind of depends on what the control is referencing. We'll get into that in a second. But I do want to start with this layout because that's where everything starts. Always remember that all the way up the chain, your bar itself has a flex layout. So what that is doing is that is saying, how will my children, which are these containers, behave within myself, the bar? For the container, you are with this self flex telling it how to behave within that bar, but then you're also telling the container's children how to behave. So there's kind of these stair steps of layers, and it really unlocks so much potential with what you can create. And you'll see that here in just a second. So with regards to the layout, we'll just kind of work our way right down this control. At the very core, I'm actually going to do this real fast. At the very core, we have our direction, which is either a row or a column. Actually, my bar is a little tiny there. All right. So we have rows and columns. Pretty straightforward so far. Rows run horizontally, columns run vertically. Technically, reversing those layouts is part of the direction, but we've kind of put it into a checkbox here, so you can just think, okay, I need a row, and maybe I want to swap that around. Now, what's happening here is, remember, I made my container fill up all the space here in this bar. So think of it, when I reverse it, it's kind of like take a mirror image of what that content looks like. So over here, we've got blue on the left, yellow on the right, and then we're swapping it all the way over to the side. So now blue is on the right, yellow is on the left on the inside. You're just moving that around. If I were to make this container just standard, so behave kind of like you would expect a normal web element to lay out, reversing it, you'll just see that content kind of swap back and forth. With wrapping, I'll walk through this in a little more detail in a bit, but you have to be very explicit with Flexbox in telling it what you want it to do. I've seen some people use it before where they're kind of expecting it to maybe the container gets kind of small and their content's getting kind of squished and they expect it to maybe break below, like they might with some grids or maybe the way you're floating things. Flexbox doesn't do that. You really have to be very explicit with how you want it to behave. So if you don't tell the children to wrap when things get too tiny, they will just, as long as they can, stay in a row. So just keep that in mind when you're working through layouts. And then down here is where things get much more approachable than how they are in the spec. Depending on the layout you use, row, column, reverse, you have to think what they call how the main axis and cross axis work. So if you have a row, the main axis is horizontal and the cross axis is vertical. And if you have a column, that switches. It's a little funky to think about. It can kind of make your head start spinning around a little bit. What we wanted to do is just, since we're building a visual editor, we want you guys to think and build visually, not be having to think of these abstractions. So notice that when I'm in a row, I've got these 5 settings here: start, center, end, space between, and space around. And then these 4 for vertical. If I change this to a column, you'll notice those 4 choices that were in vertical are now in horizontal. And my 5 that were up here are now down in vertical. So we, with this control, kind of take care of that axis swapping for you. You just kind of can think, okay, I need a row or a column, and then how do I want to orient things within that space? So it's really nice, very approachable. And here we'll see how that stuff kind of works. So we'll start with start, which will place all of the children within your container or your parent to the start of that container, which for us would be, or for me would be the left. If you were using, if you had a RTL site, right to left language, what's really cool is Flexbox will automatically swap that for you. So you can design one header using all these Flexbox controls. And if you're smart about how it's laid out, you don't have to design a totally different one for, maybe you have 2 versions of your site for different languages. You can just have that one header. Very cool feature. Very cool. If we do center, everything is oriented there. End is to the end. And then space between and space around are really neat. Essentially, space between will try to orient an item always to the very edge, if it can, and then put equal spacing in between the items in here. Whereas space around, so notice that like the space between these 2 buttons, if you divided it in half, you've got equal spacing on either side of the buttons. So there's a little subtle nuance there, but definitely very cool and lots of neat stuff to achieve there. If we made, actually, I need to do this. So vertically, we can do the start of our bar, centered, end, or stretch. Now, stretch will not always work on every element depending on the way it's set up. It might not be appropriate for some elements. So that's why you might see that. We also, and so just keep that in mind. Typically, we find most people really just want to center stuff, and then they might want to go into an individual element like a toggle or something and make it 100% height. Now, this is something you couldn't do normally with just out of the box, pun intended, I suppose. With Flexbox, there's a lot of markup and styling going on behind the scenes that are allowing you guys to achieve this stuff where you can maybe center everything, but then also make something 100% height as you want it. So we'll explore that a little more later. Now again, if I swap this layout, okay, so what's happened here? Again, notice that we have taken care of changing your options available to you here. So now instead of stretching vertically, since we're in a column, our main axis is now vertical. So we're stretching across horizontally. Lots of directions, I know, but you can just see it visually how it's working here. So horizontally, we've got those options. And then vertically, we can now do start, center, end, space between, space around. And this is really cool. I mean, even looking at this, it makes me think of, I don't know if you guys frequent Pitchfork for your music news or not, but looking at a layout like this, you could absolutely achieve this with the header builder. I should probably build this out for fun. You could do like a container over here with a column layout with your 3 icons. Maybe do a container around this. Column layout with an image and a nav. Whoops. And then another column over here, or a container with a column layout. Tons of possibilities. Really cool stuff to explore. So that's Flex layout. So again, that just dictates how your children elements are behaving. And then for this self-flex property, I'm going to explore that somewhere else, I think. Really fast on this. Let me just center, start. One second here. Okay, so just a quick note on this. Notice how I have space between set, and I'm getting all this space because my container is big enough that I have space for my buttons to be spread out. That only works because I have it set up here. If I just had a standard container, notice that space between isn't any different from start or end or center. Just keep that in mind as you're working with these elements. If a layout is not doing exactly what you expect it to, it might be because of the way you have the parent set up. Maybe it's not wide enough to actually show anything off. So if I made this fill all the space, okay, now we're seeing it center within the bar, and we can work in that. So yeah, so that is kind of Flex layout. Let me hop over to footers for a second, because we can probably see this Flex control a little better with these columns. And this, again, can get real funky real fast, but I'm going to try to just show some really cool real-life examples of how you might want this. So with the self flex, you have 3 properties. There's flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. We have those presets like we talked about, but you can also get in and tweak these individually as you want. Think of flex grow as essentially a setting that says, you might have a box that's 360 pixels wide, but maybe you want it to, if it can, fill any available space that's there. So let me actually just hop into each of these columns. Set these to 0. Oh, not an O, a 0. Okay. Whoops. I copied and pasted something there. Okay. So these are all set to 0 now. And with this basis we'll get to in a second, these are essentially just 360 pixels wide, and they're not going to go any wider than that if they can. But let's say I wanted like just my center column here to be wider. Well, instead of making it a wider basis, maybe we want that to still be this foundational piece, but we could make it a 1. And so what 1 is essentially doing is it's saying, hey, if there's any extra space, like, give that to me. I'm going to take that up if I can. And this can be a really cool effect that you can use to achieve some really cool proportional layouts. Like Chris Coyer's got a really good example here. If you have some content that these won't behave the exact same way because there's lots going on here with this text, but if you had simple stuff like navigation items, maybe just had some links. Notice if these were all 1, they would equally fill a container out, but if you set 1 to 2, it kind of tries to, It's not quite double, but it proportionally tries to grow relative to those other elements. Again, for the most part, I tend to use a 0 if I don't want it to grow, or a 1 if I do want it to grow. All right. I keep copying and pasting things here. So keep that in mind with growing. Shrink, kind of the same thing. It takes an integer, just like flex grow. It can be any number you really want, but for the most part, I either use a 0 if I want the container or the element to not shrink at all. So 0 means don't shrink. And a 1 will say, shrink if possible. So for the most part, you're probably going to set that to 1, and that's good to go. As for flex basis, this is a little, again, one of those kind of esoteric-y Flexbox things, but basis kind of is saying what is the foundational dimension this box should take up relative to my orientation. So since I have, since my bar here is set up as a row and my basis here is 360, this is kind of like saying 360 pixels wide is how wide it should be. That can be a percentage. It can be auto if you'd like it to be that. And everything kind of has a different effect. You'll really just want to play around with it and see kind of the different effects. But I'll show you some really cool things you can do here with these columns to achieve some different looks. So again, take note that I have on my bar here, it's a row. I've told my children, these containers, to wrap. Horizontally, they're in the center. And then vertically, they're stretching. So if you haven't noticed, this layout would not normally be possible without Flexbox. You would typically see something like this, which is fine. That might be the look you're okay with or after. But with that stretch option, we can get those equal height columns, or we could orient them towards the end, or we could center them on each other. So already you're kind of seeing some cool, funky stuff going on there. But let me do this. So I'm going to set these back to 1. So again, these are filling space if they can. Now what this is doing is basically saying, try to maintain a 360 pixel width as long as you can. And this is a really cool concept to take advantage of, because what you can kind of do is, without specifying breakpoints, you can kind of create responsive designs that you don't really have to tell it when to break. It will just break when you specify it down here. So these will try to maintain a 360 pixel width as long as they can. So as I shrink this down, you'll see, okay, right there. So if I were to, measure that, I missed the end there a little bit, but that's right at 360, and right here is where that breaks. So again, it's wrapping below because it's trying to maintain that space. Now what we've also done here is we've set a max width on these. So that's saying, maybe you do want it to be a little wider if possible, but you could match it 360 so that it never grew too much. Or what's really cool is you could take that max width off altogether and get something like this. So now we're starting to see some really cool ideas. So again, here, I've taken that max width off. I want it to always be 360 as long as it possibly can. So right here, it's gonna break. And since we have no max width, and since we have flex grow set to 1, we get a full width column that fills all that space below. Very cool look and layout. And then again, right here, these are getting close to being 360, so those are going to break. All right, and now we have 3 columns stacked on top of each other. And they have a little bit of margin that's spacing them out, but that's how we get that look. And then again, if we want these to not be, let's say we never want them to go beyond 360 either, we can just put a max width on them. Pretty cool. So notice these, right as they hit that space, they'll break. And then you'll notice that they will shrink though eventually. So if they get down to their very end where they have no more space to break to, they don't say, okay, well, I can't be smaller than 360 pixels. The browser will actually say, okay, well, this is kind of the smallest you can be. So now just take up or resize with the rest of the browser. So really cool effect. And again, so you can play around with all this. The Flex Grow. It's really about kind of mixing and matching these options and the things you can achieve with that. And then we can play around with, for example, if I go back up to the bar, you know, how I play with this will get me different options. So that's at the start, center, end, space between, space around. So that's a kind of a cool look. I mean, there's just all sorts of layout possibilities that really just come from playing with how you orient the layout and then how you orient those flex options for the columns themselves. Let me see, like, so if I did, I'm just going to play with an idea here for a second. Yeah, so notice these aren't trying to match. Oh, and notice, this is all subtle little stuff, but notice how these change too. So when these are all in a row, this third column is the largest column, right? Text is the lengthiest, and all of these match that. Once that third one breaks below, because we've run out of space, notice how these two match each other, and this one is just relative to itself. So it's kind of cool how that stuff gracefully kind of falls back. So anyway, that's a very brief kind of overview on how you can achieve columns and get them to behave responsively. And so remember for that example that this flex basis, you can think of it as like, that's how I never want this element to shrink beyond this dimension as long as it can. So it'll try to maintain 360 up until the very last moment when it has to shrink because we're at that small screen there. So that is a really cool responsive trick there. Oh, and this guy, this column, notice what we've done here. We're filling up all the space, we are shrinking, and we just told it to be always 100% wide. So that is how this column down here is always at the bottom, and it makes for a really cool call to action kind of effect. All right. Let me actually jump back to headers. Hop back in our Flexbox layout here. And let me talk for a second about, we're going to talk about orientation and dimensions and all sorts of stuff in here. So give me 1 second to add these social buttons in here, because this will help us see things a little bit better. I'll just do the one here. All right. So I want to take a brief moment to talk about this dimensions box, because this is kind of based around Flexbox. Not necessarily the height or the width, but these other ones here. So notice that if I have a top or a bottom bar, I will have a height control here, which I can specify as a fixed height, or it could be 100 pixels. You know, we could do viewport units, so 100 VH, so that's saying 100, basically 100% the height of my screen. You can also do height auto. Now, when you do height auto, that's typically like on that columns example we just showed, the height on that bar is auto, and that's because it's more of a content bar. We want it to physically change dimensions as the screen gets smaller. Stuff is going to wrap and it's going to get taller, so we need to set it to auto. And when you do that, we actually have you have padding that you can start playing with and designing on that. But for right now, let's just say we have this, and then again for this bar we have our width. Now this outer spacing here has to do with this little bit of space, notice that this container doesn't go all the way to the edge. There's a little bit of a gap at either side down here. That is the outer spacing control. So that is the same for both of these, but the outer spacing on a top or bottom bar is going to be to the sides here. So if I were to change this to 0, these didn't change, but notice that my container is now full width. Okay. So that's really great if you truly want like a full width content in your bar that's never percentage based. But you just always want a little bit of a gap at the end there. And it's also the way we've set it up. I'll kind of demonstrate this in a bit, but that padding is always maintained if you are scrolling, if you have overflowed content. Whereas if you're just using typical padding, it wouldn't be. It kind of looks unfinished normally, but it's a really great little trick we've added in for you guys. And so same thing here. We can say, okay, remove that outer spacing, put it back in. Now the content length, this says length because, not width or height, because this is Flexbox based. So the length for a top or bottom bar is going to essentially be the width of that bar, how much space you're allowing the containers to be in. So if I change this to 50%, oh, I'm in my sidebar here. Notice that this container is now 50% the height of the bar, whereas up here, it's now 50% the width of that bar. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Whichever bar you're working in, that's how that length operates. If we set that back to 100, and if we set this guy back to 100, we also have a max length. So you might have you might want it full width, or maybe you want it to be, my apologies, I keep clicking on the wrong bar. Maybe you want this to be, 90%, so never quite at the edge. But you also want a max length of 1,000 pixels or ems or whatever you want to use. So that will maintain that space. And you can see this if I change oops, that's my bar. 1 second. So here's my container. Notice that it's hitting that 1,000 pixel max, so it's never going to go beyond that. But then right here, now it's maintaining that 90% width in that space. And if I were to take off 100, or if we were to just do auto, which is another one that we use sometimes, if we did none, notice that outer spacing is always equal with what I'm working with. So that's a really important one to keep in mind too, how that outer spacing works and how you want it to behave. So again, here we could do 90% length. Let's do 80 so you can see it. So again, this is 80% the height of the container, but maybe I want the max length of it to be 400 pixels. That's probably 200. So same thing there. And that will respond as the browser shrinks horizontally and vertically. So a little bit to take in there, but just keep that in mind how that behaves, and it's kind of working with the orientation you're in those bars. All right, so let's take a moment here. I'm actually going to hop out. And we'll walk through a few other concepts here that you can see. So I'm going to actually make a new template from the standard middle here. And we're just going to inspect this and just talk about this concept here and how you might want to use it. So I call this the kind of true center or absolute center technique. And it's important for a reason. It's a little subtle thing, but for those designers of you, I know you're out there, who every little pixel matters. This will really help your OCD to get everything in order for you. So something I see a lot of people do sometimes is you might have a container. And let's just say we have this set to standard. We'll set this to standard. And that is no shrink, so that's fine. And let me actually just, 1 second here, on my container. I'm going to add a little bit of padding to the side of these containers so you can see this a little better. So this one will be 50 and 50. So again, this container, you're not going to see it visually necessarily, but remember this container is essentially longer than this container because of that padding I've added, okay? So now one thing you might think you could do is just add, and this is our mobile container, so don't worry about that guy, but you might think, oh, okay, I want to have 2 navigations on either side and have a logo in the middle. And you might think, aha, space between. I remember that guy from earlier, Corey. Well, that's what we're doing here, right? So on our bar, we have a row, and we have space between set up. So that is between each column or container, there's a little bit of space. But you'll notice that since this container is wider, it's actually pushing this logo over more. I can make it even more drastic, and you'll see it a little bit better. There we go. So notice how, this logo, while in theory it should be in the center, and it is in the center, the space between here has to be equal. We're not getting the right spacing because these items are longer. And this would happen, for example, if, let's say your navigations were uneven. Maybe you had 3 links over here and 4 links over here. Or maybe you have 3 and 3, but maybe one of your links is, contact us today instead of just contact. Well, that would do this effect. It would push that logo to the side. So to achieve a true center, what we need to do is click our container, our side containers, and essentially force this to fill space equally. So now what that's going to do by itself is that guy is just, he's very greedy right now. He's basically saying, give me all the space I can take. And since we have this set to no shrink, that's why this is fine. If we were to get rid of that, in some cases you might see it push in on that logo a little bit. But now what we want to do with this container is set it to fill space equally as well. Okay. So now what we've got here, we've got no shrink, and then 1 second here. This actually is that padding is messing up with that. That's because my padding is super long on here. So let me just get rid of it so we can see here. There we go. So now what you're noticing is this container, if I were to measure it, we've got 585, 586. Same thing over here. 585, 586. And this logo is taking up, it's right in the center. So no matter how big my content is, it's always going to maintain that positioning. And then, I just specify when I want to hide those other columns or those containers. And what's kind of cool here is since I have the bar set up to space between, and since I have this mobile container after everything, when I hide these 2 containers at a certain breakpoint, again, it's at space between, so this container now bumps all the way to the side, and this mobile container stays over there. So I didn't even have to tell it to move. I just had to kind of think through my layout and how I wanted it to behave, and it will all kind of move with this Flexbox magic to the space I want it to be at. So very cool trick there, that true centering. That's a really important one to keep in mind. Let's talk about vertical centering. So I will hop out of here. And a good one for this would be our sticky template. I'll actually make a new one just in case I mess something up. Flexbox 3. Let's edit that guy. All right, so with this, and I'm going to turn this sticky bar off okay, there we go. So with this, what you want to keep in mind is if you make a bar that you want to take up all the space. So there's a little bit going on here. Sorry, I'm kind of gathering my thoughts for this. There's a little bit going on here. Essentially, the effect we were going for was we want to have, and actually let me save this, and I will make this my global. Hop back in here. Now we can hop out and look at it. This will be a little off center because of the admin bar up here, but the effect here that we're going for is we wanted a full height bar, but we wanted it to be offset by the height of our bar down here so that you could see that. And then when you hit that bar, it starts moving with you. Okay, so that's the technique there. So to achieve that on this bar, we're using a little CSS calc magic, which if you're not familiar with is a really cool feature to look into. But essentially what we're saying here is we want this bar to be 100% the height of the viewport. That's what this VH is. Minus the 120 pixels that this bar is right here. Okay, so that's a really important concept to kind of think about. And so now what we have is this big canvas that's always the full height of the window, minus the height of the bar below there. Pretty neat. Let me get this back here. So what we can do is this container, since we have a height on the bar, the container will always be 100% height of its bar if you have a height on it. So we basically are just telling our container, hey, I want to center my content horizontally and vertically. It's that simple. And then within your container, you simply add the headline and the buttons that you want. And how we're actually getting this to wrap, again, this goes into some of that stuff. We have wrap children on. And then on the headline here, we are telling it to be 100% wide. So we're just always forcing that width. And since it's taking up all that space, we can force these buttons down to a new line and they just kind of take up their space and everything works perfectly as you would expect it to. So vertical centering, very easy. If you need vertical centering, but also, maybe something like this where you need an element, but then a couple elements below it. You don't need to get crazy with lots of columns I keep saying columns, containers. You can really do a lot with just thinking through all those flex options. Okay, I can make it wrap. I can make that text 100% width, and that'll force everything else below it. So very cool stuff there. Let's talk about, yes, 1 second here. I'll make another one. Oops. Flexbox 4. Let's make this global. We'll edit that. So another one you might see, or an effect you might be going for, is kind of this equal width menu item look. We actually get, that's not what I wanted. This to be 0. Let me just start from the navigation. And I'll just do integrity for now. Okay. So if in the past, if you wanted to have a menu where you had links in a row, and maybe you wanted them to all be, the equal width, it was always very hard to do because depending on if you added a new menu item, you always had to do stuff with percentages. So like, for example, I've got 5 links here, 100 divided by 5, 20% for each. So you would say, okay, each one be 20%. Well, then if you wanted to add, another link, well, now you've got to do 100 divided by 6 and you've got to specify the width for that. It got a little better when calc came along because you could say, okay, these should be, 100 divided by whatever the number is that I'm doing. But still, you always had to change the CSS based on the content. And the whole goal with our CSS, as much as possible, we want to kind of style it, and we want to be able to throw anything at it and it just work. And with Flexbox, we can now do that. So the first thing you'll want to do for this kind of equal width menu item effect is find our container. And we want to make sure that our container fills, again, all the space. You'll see me doing this a lot. This is a very common pattern I use when I'm building stuff out. So now our container is filling all the space. So now what we can do is that means we can take our menu here and we can, so this is, the inline navigation is the only menu that has all these flex options on it. Everything else is kind of oriented vertically and you can just style it as necessary. This is the only one that has all these options because it's a little more involved and you can do a lot more with it, but it keeps the other ones simple and it gives you the flexibility you need here. So for this self flex, that is saying for the menu, what do I want it to do? So we would like it to fill space equally. Now notice that the menu is now all the way across, but you'll notice that if I hover on these items, notice how our active effect here is only appearing right over the menu item. That's because we haven't told these items to fill all their space. This will be a good time to show you a little bit of the difference. If I do fill space, not much changed other than the fact that now the red you'll see is going full width there. And actually I'm going to use this works better with what I'm trying to achieve. But if we were to click fill space equally, you'll see again, the content is pretty uniform here, so you didn't see much of a shift there. But now things are truly equal width. So if I were to go in with a ruler and measure out the spacing of each one of these, you would see that they are totally equal width there. This works great with if you want to pair it with content scrolling. So this is a really cool technique. We'll go up to the bar, turn content scrolling on. Now what this does is if you're in a top or bottom bar, it will allow you, if your content is too wide, to scroll horizontally. And if you're in a sidebar, you can scroll vertically. So it's great for sidebars because if you just have tons of content you need to fit in there, or you have a really tall navigation, but a user's on a smaller screen, they can scroll and get to stuff. And it also enables us to achieve this really cool responsive nav pattern I'm seeing a lot lately on like Google and Medium, where once your links kind of hit a certain width, you just want to keep scrolling, and instead of hiding it and showing a new menu, it makes things a lot simpler. So how that would work is we turn this on, and then you're going to want to set this to auto. That's important for this menu technique here. Then we can hop into the menu here and go to our top links, and we will set a min width on each of our links. So we will say, you know, we're filling all this space, but we never want them to be any smaller than, let's say, 140 pixels, okay? So now if I hop over to the front end and I start shrinking this down, again, notice how they're always responding, but then at some point they're gonna stop responding. And actually I need to make them a little bit bigger. That was too tiny. One second here. Oops. So let's do 180 pixels. Save that. Start sizing this down. Okay, so notice right there, they've caught that 180 mark, right? And now this is overflowing, but what's really neat is I can still scroll to it. So again, imagine a really small navigation where you can scroll to all your items rather than having to set up a completely new navigation and style something totally different. It's just a really cool, different technique that you might want to play around with, and it works great, especially if you have just tons of items. So I mean, if I were to go to medium, so this is where they have it. So notice how they have a little navigation here with a lot of items here, a lot of categories to click through. If I get to this point, I can scroll through those items and get to them. So it's nice because it keeps things really simple. I don't have to style multiple navs. Very accessible. It's very, natural for users on a mobile to kind of swipe left and right and work through stuff. So a very cool technique to keep in mind when you're working on things. Let me see here. I've got a few other things I was going to talk about. Oh yeah, sometimes this Flexbox layout is very granular in terms of, with these links, we actually order our content with Flexbox as well. So you can experiment with, if you want to flip the side this icon is on, you can hit that reverse. So this content flex layout is telling the content of this link what to do. Or I can make it a column. We could reverse that. And then the text looks a little funky, but I could go over here and I could center it and center that. And now you're starting to see we're getting some really cool different looks here. If I hop back to the front. And so it's very powerful. And then you pair this with, we're going to do a video on these particles, these animation effects, and how you can design really wild, really cool looks. But hopefully you're starting to get a sense of kind of what is possible with this. You know, we could do start. Let me hop back over here. Take the centering off. So yeah, you can play with that. Maybe we want to end it. You could orient the text again. So you can play, there's lots of different ideas that you can start playing around with. And it's very cool when you just dig in and see what's possible. So that is the menu flex content layout. And then a final little bonus one I wanted to chat about, because it's available in a few of our modules or elements, is flex ordering. So let me fire open the cart here. Add a little space back. Oh, and I've got, again, keep in mind when you have content scrolling turned on, content cannot overflow anymore. So you can't have drop downs, things like that. You could still use like an off canvas navigation with content scrolling, or a modal, because those are positioned outside the bar, but anything that would normally overflow the bar can't be seen, and that's because of just the way CSS works. So if you need scrolling, you can't have drop downs, unfortunately. But so we've got that cart there. Let's just apply the integrity preset. So notice that when I activate this, you know, we've got a few sections here. We've got a title, we've got our items, total, and our buttons. If you dig into the cart, one of the first things you'll see in the setup here is you can order things if you want. So you can get rid of the title just by making this blank. But if you wanted to experiment with different layouts, like let's say the first thing you wanted people to see was the total and then items second, you can do that here. Or if you wanted your buttons second and your items third, you can do that. Now you would have to, you know, restyle it a bit to get the spacing correct. You know, notice how it's butting up against here because it was intended for this layout right here. But this opens up a lot of really cool possibilities where, you know, you could test, A/B test, you know, hey, what works better, my buttons at the top or the bottom? What makes people more engaged with, you know, what they're interacting with on my site or what they're purchasing? The same thing happens with our search. If I go back here, add a search inline. We'll do the integrity. So notice that in here, I've got, this is very subtle, but I've got my search bar and I've got my submit to the left of the input. And then if I start typing and searching, the clear will come up. So just a standard kind of search functionality. But if I wanted to, like icon uses a different layout. So with icons preset, the input is here and the X is in the middle now and the input is all the way to the side. And that is done with the same ordering controls. And these are subtle things, but they are the little details, the little flourishes that make one site different from the other and stand out and really give you an ability to play around with ideas. And that works because behind the scenes, this search is laid out with Flexbox. Now, we don't really give you the option to to do all the space between stuff or anything, because really just the ordering gives you a different look. Same thing with this cart. It would get a little funky if we gave controls for like rows and space between. There would just be too much to think through. So with this, you get a really nice way that you can play with ordering things. And that's something to keep in mind too. While we don't have order controls on things in the builder, if you have a child theme on, or if you're using some custom CSS, you can target anything that's positioned with Flexbox, and you can use, where did I pass it? Right here at the beginning. You can use this order property, which basically says, where you want things to fall in the markup. So if I were to actually make this the integrity one again, save that. And if I go to the front end here, inspect this. So you'll see that the input here is actually the first item inside the form here, but this button is coming before it and this button's coming after it. Notice that the order property over here is updating for each of these elements. So that's something fun you can play with too. If you need a little, if you need that for some reason, you really shouldn't, because with containers and elements, you can put them wherever you want. But just another little Flexbox trick to kind of keep up your sleeve and play around with as necessary. So I think for the most part, that kind of covers everything I wanted to touch on with Flexbox and the builders. We will, of course, be adding more resources as we go forward. And if anything else pops up, we will definitely try to get a little demonstration video together, or write some notes down on different things to keep in mind. But definitely play around with it. Oh, one thing before I go, this is important. When you are laying out, I've seen some examples where people maybe have a, this is common. You might have a kind of desktop bar that's oriented horizontally, and then maybe you want to hide that bar completely and then make a mobile bar that's laid out as a column layout instead, so your content is all vertical. If you do that, one thing that I've typically seen is sometimes people will, so maybe they have some columns that are, or some containers that are set to fill space equally, and it works. Maybe you've got 3 here on desktop, but then on mobile, on some mobile browsers or some browsers in general, fill space equally in a column layout can kind of be a little funky if the height isn't set quite right or you're doing something. So typically on mobile, if you do that, you would want to probably use a no shrink on your containers. And that will make sure that the containers themselves will never collapse with the bar that they're in, but they will still grow based on their content that they're holding. For the most part, though, I would say a technique like this is probably the best thing you would want, because it allows you, just unless you need some sort of drastically different layout from desktop to mobile, then I would say hide one, show the other. But if you can, I would always try to get away with, again, using our Flexbox settings creatively so that content is wrapping, responding. And this, really is so neat and clean. And it just takes a little bit of time to kind of think through, what do we need? And I guarantee you there's probably almost anything you can imagine you could still achieve with a simple 1-bar setup, just making sure it's all put in there. So, but just keep that in mind in case you do have a totally different bar and you want a pure column layout. That no shrink setting is an important one on your containers. So guys, that is a somewhat deep dive into the world of Flexbox. There's just a world of possibility out there with these settings and these new modules, these elements. I hope this has been helpful to explain a few concepts. If you guys have any questions, of course, do not hesitate to let us know. We are always here to work with you guys and provide a little guidance. So thank you very much for your time, and have a great day.